just, I mean, my question is, what is this adding? What are we trying to prove or disprove here? What is the outcome meant to be?
Welcome to Disrupted Science, the occasional conversation between the authors of the upcoming book, How the Internet Disrupted Science, now available for pre-order. I'm Kent Anderson, here with my co-author, Joy Moore, and today is Wednesday, February 18th, 2026. Hey, Joy.
Hey, Kent, how's it
How you
going?
doing? It, it's,
I,
it's, we,
I
we,
got you
we,
first.
it's going okay. How's it going with you?
Pretty good. I just got back from pickleball.
Oh,
I had,
yeah.
yeah, I had a great game, and I made it an amazing shot, and I pulled, or let's just say I twerked a muscle that I didn't know I had.
Twerked. Is that a, is that a Miley Cyrus version of tweaked?
Yeah, I guess tweaked. Yeah,
Okay.
but
Gives
yeah,
us some indication of where you might be experiencing some pain, but it was worth it, right? No pain, no gain kind of thing.
it was totally worth it. Yeah, but it reminded me that I need to do equal parts yoga to
Hmm.
pickleball. So,
Right, 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 right.
that's what you
Slow
have to
exertion
do.
versus fast exertion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm glad you made the shot. That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah. What's on your shirt today?
Oh, this is Lucas and
Mm-hmm.
his ripping the guitar face. He's the guy who provides our music. So that's Provoke the Truth. That's Lucas Rodriguez, and he's a fantastic guy. But this shirt is that's his look and his brand. Um,
That's amazing.
it's
Yeah.
it's so fun. It's so fun. So every time I wear this, I'm like he's such a smart guy about branding.
Mm-hmm.
He's a great player and everything, but he's really smart about branding. So he's got this little media empire that he started up, and everybody orders his merch because it's this kind of stuff, right? It's really fun and interesting and
Yeah.
personal and everything. So yeah.
Yeah. It's all about the merch to support the brands
Mm-hmm.
these
Yeah.
days. Um,
We need to get our merch out there some more. We probably should like do some photographs of our faces when we see some things
yeah,
online that
like
we're I think we just got one. I'll screen grab that later.
like
Nice job.
oh.
All right, Joy, I think your audition is successful. Oh God. Whoa, whoa. I got to blur that one out. All right, if you're watching this on YouTube, apologies for my saucy compatriot. All right, but speaking of that, we're running across a lot of that kind of stuff lately. And so
Yeah.
it's extra it's extra face making kind of
Mm-hmm.
days these days. And we're not
Yeah.
alone, right?
No, a lot of people have been making some faces and using some saucy language in defense of science and academic integrity and public health. And so we've been following Colette and Stand Up for Science and everything that she's doing.
Hmm.
If you don't follow her on Blue Sky, you definitely should.
Yeah.
And
Or
you
LinkedIn
should,
too.
or LinkedIn, and you should, you know, pay attention to what she's talking about and contribute if you can.
Right.
And
Same for Beth Jacobs.
same for Beth Jacobs, and Greg Gonzalez, and
Hmm.
lots of other people are just calling shots as they see them. They're kind of fed up.
Yeah.
And we had the opportunity the other day to speak with two business school professors from Australia who are fed up with what they're seeing from their perspective as looking at the academic record and seeing it get out of control.
Hmm.
And we ran into them because we read their paper that they published and an opinion piece that they published. And we reached out to them because a lot of the themes that they're picking up on are themes that we care about. And
Hmm.
they were gracious enough to take the time to talk to us across many, many time zones to give us their perspective.
Yeah, and climate zones too. They're down there sweating it out in
Yeah.
Australia, and we're up here freezing.
Hmm.
So that was also interesting. But yeah, so Martina Linnenluecke and Carl Rhodes are the two people we talked to, both business professors down in Sydney. And it was kind of interesting to kind of, one of the takeaways we had is they're really talking about how there's a secondary market that publishers have created serving authors and their career demands. And that
Hmm.
market is proving rather dysfunctional
Yeah.
and counter a lot of the norms and expectations that scientists have about evidence and quality and care. So it was a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, I think it's an example of you get what you wish for it in a
Right, be careful what you wish for, you just might get it kind of thing, right?
right, because in the neoliberal capital markets, it's going to expand to absorb what people are willing to pay for, no matter what the payment sources are.
Hmm.
And so I think we get into that a little bit in the discussion with Carl and Martina.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, you
so,
change incentives, you create incentives,
right.
which is an interesting thing. But without further ado, we're going to let you hear from them. So here is our interview with Martina Linnenluecke and Carl Rhodes. Carl Rhodes is professor of business and society at the University of Technology Sydney Business School. Carl researches the relationship between liberal democracy and contemporary capitalism. Martina Linnenluecke is an internationally recognized scholar who conducts research on corporate adaptation and resilience to global climate change. She's also at the University of Technology Sydney Business School. Welcome to you both. How are you?
Very
Yeah,
well,
good,
thanks.
thank
Good to be
you.
here.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you both.
So can you tell us a little bit about what you do beyond the little bit that I rattled off there?
Do you want to go
Yeah,
first,
sure.
Martina?
Yeah, I'd start. So I am heading up the Center for Climate Risk and Resilience at the University of Technology Sydney. So that's UTS. And the research that we do that's focusing on essentially the impacts of climate change, what companies can do to adjust to those impacts. We are also researching, decarbonization and yeah, essentially what can be done to avoid the worst consequences of climate change through meaningful action.
And Carl?
And yeah, your intro kind of summed it up pretty well, but kind of my interests are in the relationship between business and society, more particularly the relationship between kind of free market capitalist economy on the one hand and how that balances with a democratic society, suggesting that balance is often out of balance. I'm sorry,
Mm,
that relationship is often out of balance. So I'm interested in how kind of business and economic activity relates to the rise of right-wing political populism, how it relates to issues of economic justice and economic inequality. I'm also a recently reformed business school dean. I was dean here until just a bit less than a year ago, and so I've kind of returned to the honest professorial profession after some years doing that.
very nice. It's kind of appropriate. We're talking to you on, it's an evening, February 12th, just to time place this. This will go up next week on the 18th. But today, the Trump administration, speaking of right-wing populist movements, rolled back all the environmental regulations about global warming in the U.S. So it looks like we're
Yeah.
talking to two of the right people, and your work caught our attention in scientific and scholarly publishing when you published on The Conversation on January 5th, article entitled The Five Stages of Enshittification of Academic Publishing. And this was related to your 2025 Speaking Out article in the journal Organization entitled The Junkification of Research. How did two business school professors take an interest in our little world?
I think,
Yeah, actually remember how this whole idea started. Carl and I, we were both at a function and we started to talk about, just what we'd kind of seen in terms of, recent developments in academia. Obviously, Carl has got the dean's perspective as well around what motivates people in terms of, publication incentives and whatnot. And we were just, yeah, having a very critical chat around journal rankings and how some colleagues have just kind of started to just produce papers rather than actually ideas and knowledge. And, we've also kind of reached a point now where we often see colleagues saying, oh, look, I published another paper and, it's like in this journal, but we don't really learn anything more about what's really driving that content, that output, the idea, what's the contribution, right? And from there, we also, our conversation kind of went also onto other topics. And we were both also observing how we're actually seeing more and more stuff being published and more just absolutely massive volumes of publications that are coming out. But there is often just absolutely no contribution. And some of it is just, outright. Um, Questionable, I would like to say, in terms of the
Mhm.
method, the findings, and yeah, so it's all that's I think when the idea sort of started, and we said, okay, we need to look into that a little bit further, and yeah, that's probably how we first got to talk about it. Mm.
Mhm. And the thing is, too, I mean, Ken, you talk about your world. I mean, your world is the world of all researchers. I mean, not that everyone researches this as a topic, but anyone who's kind of publishing work is kind of caught up in this system. And I think Martina and I were just getting, uh, not angry, but were just very dissatisfied with the whole system and decided to intervene in a small way, kind of as a side project to our main research agendas. But I'll tell you another story. I was at a conference a few years ago, Management and Organization Studies conference, and I was in a conference stream, the topic of which was economic inequality. And it was run by some fairly high-profile people from well-known universities, and people presenting papers on this, as I was. And at the end of every single paper, the conveners asked the paper presenters, where do you plan to publish this paper? To the point of obsession. And the whole discussion in this conference stream was around where are you going to publish your paper on inequality? And I started asking questions like, has your research actually affected inequality in some way? Like, who has benefited from this, given the actual topic? And I felt like I was kind of made to feel like I was asking stupid questions and that that's not relevant and that all should matter is how are you going to publish in some top tier kind of, high ranked journal. And it was, honestly, that experience has stayed with me. Ever since. And I mean, there's more to what we're calling, Enshittification than that, but that's certainly a part of it. So there's really our whole kind of profession is at stake in this in many ways, I'd say.
Yeah.
That's yeah, the obsession with how to publish, where to publish, as opposed to what the actual content is and who it's serving,
Yeah.
has really taken over. So can you talk us through your five stages of the enshittification of academic publishing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are certainly a number of factors that play into this, what we call this, downward spiral,
Yeah.
essentially, that's taking us towards this undesirable outcome, right? And it sort of starts with, what we already discussed, right? That it really shifts value from intellectual merit to marketability. So it's often not really about advancing knowledge. It's not really about, advancing what we kind of really need in terms of insights for our society. It's really driven by, okay, what's going to get me published? But then also for the publishers, it's obviously how can we increase submissions, publication output, volumes, and so on. And I see that like even from an editorial perspective, that there is often a lot of, how should I say, there's a big push on behalf of commercial publishers to see, what can we do to broaden our audience to attract more submissions. So it's really a system, I think, very much focused on throughput and output rather than really, the scholarly merit and the contributions. And then we've obviously seen, a huge proliferation of pay-to-publish journals,
Hmm.
which I think is just such an interesting development as well. Initially, it was really, in particular, the open access movement was really meant to remove a lot of the obstacles and barriers around journal access. But then this whole system just sort of, got kind of flipped almost in the sense that out of a sudden these spaces were marketed to scholars, right? They were sold to scholars for open access fees. And so now there is this real market out there, where you can actually pay and often very, very large publishing fees as the author for your paper to be published, right? And that certainly also opens a gap in the market, so to speak, not necessarily a good one, right? But it means that there is actually an avenue for people to get their articles published in some outlets that will simply accept whatever comes their way if the right access fee is being paid, which is, definitely very, very problematic part of it. And it ultimately really then leads to the next stage, the decline in quality and integrity that's following from these, profit-driven models. But yeah, then we kind of go down further, right? The next step is that, we've ultimately got such a large volume of publications out there that it becomes really difficult to identify what's actually authoritative work, what's so good, what's not good, right? And I mean, we can kind of see that, right? These days, when you just jump on Google Scholar on Google and you search for any type of topic, there is just such an array of information out there that makes it really difficult to know, especially for lay people, but also sometimes for us, what's actually good, what's the best article here, right? What's the best piece of work? And then there are lots of journals, sometimes with very obscure names, where you just don't really know anymore. Is this, actually good quality, not so good quality? Who's behind it? And, it often takes some real work to figure out what's good, what's not. Fraudulent journals are spreading at a very high rate, pirated content as well. And then that's essentially leading to our last stage, right? What we've called enshittification in the conversation article and junkification in our paper, which is, this results in a scholarly system that's really overwhelmed by this whole influx of often very low content, low quality content. And yeah, where we just see this real distortion by profit motives ultimately, but certainly also by the scholarly desire to publish and to publish a lot and to publish fast. So it's
Hmm.
just really there are a lot of forces coming together in this particular instance, and all of them are driving this essentially into what we find as a very wrong direction.
Yep. Yeah, your five stages spiral. Once I imagined that it was an intestinal tract, I couldn't erase that image from my mind. But you focus on
Yeah.
commercial publishers, but it's interesting that one of the first drivers of this was a nonprofit, Public Library of Science,
Mm.
right? So they kicked off. They were one of the major organizations to kick off the commercial open access business, and also create a junkification standard called methodologically sound, where it
Mm.
was no longer whether it was relevant to a community or novel, but if the science simply seemed like it met the standards of having a hypothesis, testing that hypothesis and making conclusions out of those tests, then it could be published. And they launched Public Library of Science, PLOS 1, which was the first mega journal. So are
Mm.
they, just to get a sense of the boundaries here, are they a commercial publisher in your model or not? Is it, because they're still trying
Not
to make money too, right?
I mean, they will still have financial realities. I think if you look at the broader kind of idea, some people call kind of academic capitalism. Um,
Hmm.
it's not just, on the one hand, it's deliberately about profit-seeking organizations making decisions based on seeking profit rather than more traditional notions of knowledge. But it's also how the culture of commerce and the culture of capitalism has infused the academic world more generally. So even organizations that aren't strictly speaking, they don't have owners that they have to return a profit to. Those organizations, through what some people would kind of call neoliberalization, still come to behave as if they were corporations,
Hmm.
even if they
Yep.
don't have those incentives. You certainly see that more broadly in the way that public universities are managed. Public universities, there are no shareholders to give any money to. In many countries, like here, public universities are technically not-for-profit organizations. But still, the kind of managerial approaches from the private sector have come to infuse what we do. So I think it's a combination of a kind of cultural force of managerialism, as well as the more concrete financial forces of actual profit seeking, kind of coincide. Exactly what happened in this particular organization, I couldn't comment specifically, but I think we need to look at it more broadly, that this
Hmm.
thing will affect people irrespective of actual profits being kind of lodged on a profit and loss statement.
Right,
Hmm.
right.
And so on that point, and this conversation has been kind of circular for a number of years, is there's a bit of a chicken and egg between academic capitalism and incentives and publishers creating business models to support them, right? So they go hand in hand. The more that academics need to publish, the more opportunities publishers are going to create to fulfill those needs. And then at the same time, it's going back and overwhelming the academics with too much information that they don't need. Has that come into your line of vision in terms of your research?
Yeah, it's definitely, what we sort of are trying to capture under the different forces that we outline in the paper as well, and the conversation piece as well, where we kind of look at the structural shifts in academia that are happening, as well as the structural shifts in online publishing. And obviously, as you say, right, one is sort of feeding into the other. It's not necessarily one is causing the other. I think they're both evolving alongside
Yeah.
each other. So, academics need the publishing spaces. Why do they do this? It just comes down to, what we were discussing before around, essentially having a system that is rewarding output, so that is sort of like one of the big driving forces here, which comes down to the rise of neoliberal logics that we have seen in academia, right, where we see a lot of impact around, the institutionalization of journals, of journal rankings, and so on. That means that authors are in need of publication spaces, and they're really restricted when you look into the top journals in every field, right? And they often have only a few issues a year. So that means that not everyone can, like, even if we all wanted to get published there, it's just not going to happen realistically, right? Because if
Right.
you've only got, a handful of issues per year, and then there might be, 8 or 9 articles per issue, sometimes even less, it just means that these journal spaces are only open to a lucky few. And that just means that everyone else globally is in search of some form of outlet for their research. And that, I think, really drives this desire for alternative journal spaces, alternative publication options, which, I think then initially gave rise to this open access publishing idea. But then again, that was very quickly turned in terms of, public actually having, these capitalist motives behind it, and commercial publishers really sort of say like, okay, this is great, right? We can actually make money here out of this. But I think we've now seen, a sort of like development of this, where it's just reached a scale that is really quite problematic. And also when you see some of the enormous profits that are being made through academic publishing, that alone unknown, I think really leads to questions of, what are we trying to do here, right? What's really the benefit of this? What's the benefit to society of having all this stuff out there and no one really can digest all this information anymore?
So,
So I
Martina,
think
you
that,
said something
yeah.
earlier I wanted to pick up on, and that was, you mentioned the lay person, right?
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that the digital publishing era has ushered in is the attention economy, which is a different economy. If all this were happening, just intramural to science and scientists, it would be one thing. But there are a lot of metrics that have emerged around that. There's a
Mhm.
lot of, kind of feeding social media companies benefiting from this proliferation as well. So what's your and whether our opinion is that science is for scientists and the lay public is not in a position to understand any individual paper, much less even a full journal of them. So, how do you see you talk some about the metrics and how measurements have entered into that? How do you factor in the attention economy and kind of the fact that now we have in the U.S. Head of we have the leading scientific health authorities basically playing the public,
Mhm.
and working them with pseudoscience.
Yeah. I mean, I think what we are seeing today as well is that there's just such a spread of misinformation and disinformation especially also in the digital landscape, where all sorts of ideas can fluctuate, and that makes it obviously so much harder to really verify where this information is coming from. And I think what we often see is also that there's just a hype around certain findings or certain papers that are coming out that are supporting a particular viewpoint. And, I think that's on all sides of the political spectrum, whatever is seen as, okay, this idea is supporting a particular viewpoint and often a contentious viewpoint, be that around vaccination, climate change. These papers often get pulled out and then find their way into all sorts of forums, into the press, into, online spaces. But it really then often raises questions around, is this actually based on proper peer-reviewed science? And we often find that there are articles being pulled out that are certainly not appearing in properly peer-reviewed literature.
Right, but they feed a
But
narrative,
sometimes
right?
yeah, yeah. And I think that's really problematic as well, that there is just this very selective sort of attention to a small number of papers that are just being used to verify, in quotation marks, verify certain viewpoints, right, without actually really, being scientifically rigorous. So that I think is also of concern. And I think sometimes for the public, the real issue is also that then some really good science is paywalled, meaning that it makes it even harder to access those kind of articles. Whereas open access stuff, you just click on it, it's there, it's available, which I think is just opening another can of worms in itself, right? But I think that also just makes it so much harder for any single person to really just verify information these days. And then there's so much of it. So you can't really just sit down and in 10, 15 minutes get a good understanding of a certain topic area, right? So yeah.
I think on top of that too, you've just had such a general questioning of expertise that's emerged through kind of recent political processes. So scientific authority in general has been questioned on fairly shaky grounds and kind of abused for political purposes. I mean, look at the kind of administration of health in the United States as an example with and it went back to Trump telling people to inject themselves with bleach during COVID, if you remember that great scientific discovery. And so that questioning of expertise more generally kind of feeds into this process as well. It's that our whole endeavor is being questioned, and I think the kind of what we're calling here enshittification um, is not helping that either, because it's actually producing producing science and research more broadly that isn't necessarily defensible good or of much value other than to the careers of the author and the bank balance of the publisher is actually feeding into that narrative about the value of expertise. So there's a kind of another kind of spiral running around the spiral there as well.
Hmm.
It sure is. And one of the biggest challenges of the rejection of expertise, the politicization of expert versus populist opinions about things that are black and white, scientific, right or wrong, right? It's now being blurred. But the push towards transparency is another buzzword, and making more things open and telling people to do their own research is part of that narrative. And I think that's working against us. The fact that so much research is open and available to be used by whoever wants to co-opt it for whatever purposes is actually working against the people who are doing the good work. And so, at the end of your piece, in the conversation, you say reclaiming academic publishing as a public good will require a return to not for profit models and sustainable open access systems. And I just wanted to press on that a bit. Why do you think open access is part of the solution?
Look, I think it's actually great to have, this accessibility of content in the right way and in the right format. When it's properly sourced, it's properly curated, it's properly peer reviewed, and, it's not just a volume of output that's available to everyone. What we're certainly seeing is that there are globally still, significant parts of both in academia, but also the public, where people simply can't afford the fees to access articles, right? I'm getting lots of requests from scholars in developing countries saying to me, okay, can you send me, your papers or some of them because I just can't afford to access them. So these accessibility hurdles, I think they're definitely creating some problematic barriers as well. And, at the end of the day, if findings are solid, there's, in my mind, absolutely no problem with making them publicly available. Certainly, there are exemptions. There are some fields where we might have privacy concerns and so on. And that was certainly also considered as part of the early open access movement. Should we really make everything public, from the beginning? But I think if we put some caveats around it, that is, in my mind, not a problem per se. And these days, whoever wants to access information will probably find a way anyway. So putting it behind a paywall, in my mind, is not really restricting access. It just makes it harder for some people to get that information. Where I really see, problems is in terms of having just no curation in some open access formats anymore, where we just see so much accepted that that's essentially just a huge influx of papers. And then when you go into these spaces and you read some of it, and it's just riddled with mistakes, and not just spelling and typos and grammar, but you actually see, okay, there's a real issue in terms of how information is being collected, the underlying model that's being tested and so on. All that is, that I think is just really problematic. So where I see definitely a need is that we just revisit this obsession with just pumping stuff out there without actually, having proper safeguards in place that the information is rigorous,
Right.
and then certainly also having some curation of this content.
So
That it's not just
let me ask
dump.
you a little bit about that because there's a model of free publication, non-peer reviewed publication that is commercial indirectly that I don't think you talked about, which is preprints.
Mm.
And a lot of the especially in biomedical preprints, the companies want those publishing companies want those because they want to get their hooks into authors early, right? Or they want to incentivize the authors to, they just want them in their supply chain early. They want preprints to do that. In the case of BioArchive and MedArchive, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, LLC, wants the content there because they want to use it to train their LLM. So there are these kind of other commercial reasons to have something where you don't even have peer review in place. I mean, what's your thought of those particular kinds of approaches to? Does that fit into enshittification?
Partially, I think. Yeah, partially, especially if stuff is published online that is later has to be withdrawn because there are problems with findings. And we see that happening again and again, right? That something gets published really quickly, it appears online, and then out of a sudden there's just this big retraction that needs to happen. And, actually, when you look into the retraction trends, that's also just, completely just another area, I think, where we see definitely how this enshittification plays out, because then sometimes, that needs to be rectified. Sometimes journals do it, sometimes they don't do it. So in my mind, if, that is not done properly without some sort of, a thought around, okay, the information that we are putting out there, is that actually built on solid science, that is, I think, where it gets problematic. And yeah, of course, right, there's this huge incentive to have it online. If it's online early, if it attracts a lot of attention, it also means it's getting cited, right? So it's driving up the impact
Right.
factor as well. Yeah.
No, but when it's on a preprint server, I've done research and seen other research where, the minority of the papers that are posted there actually get published in a journal later. So then they
Yeah.
get a DOI and they get all the trade dress.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so that, and discoverability. So I just wondered if you thought that fit into your model. So,
I think it's actually quite amazing that we've come this far into the discussion without talking about generative AI and so forth. You
oh,
did
we're
mention
getting there.
LLMs briefly,
Looks like we just got
but
there.
um, because I think part of the thing too is if people are kind of using this kind of technology to access academic work and taking the kind of sloppy digest that is produced, that's not going to distinguish between your AI generated preprint article, for example, and something that's more rigorous. But if you've then got, again, it could be a layperson or a journalist, but increasingly it's also researchers are using this, to do their literature reviews for them and so forth, then that stuff gets embedded in unknowingly, in a sense, and gets reproduced without attribution. So, I mean, that's not something we particularly wrote about, but you could see that as an especially nefarious dimension of enshittification, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm glad you brought that up because we were going to ask you about that. I mean, I think it hits in a few ways. One, you have the use of the tools and their unreliability, or just their ability to spin up papers that are meaningless, and not helpful, being a form of enshittification. And then the fact that those go back into the system and get mixed up with everything else, and you really don't know, what you're consuming later when the system spits out a whole bunch of other stuff, right? It's all mixed up. So yeah, I mean does that fit in? So those systems, do they fit into an enshittification model in your mind? Is that kind of the next step?
I think that would certainly be part of the part of the process that comes out of the process of enshittification, if you like, that then kind of results in what enshittification does,
Right.
in many ways. And I think it's kind of more dangerous. Like now, it's relatively easy to identify. I mean, most journal editors you speak to know how to identify the AI produced stuff. I mean, on the one hand, because it's kind of bland. But also, I mean, I was reviewing a paper recently, and there was kind of obvious telltale signs, including a reference to a paper of mine that I hadn't written and was published in a journal that didn't exist.
Oh, that means you've
That was
made
a
it. You're AI famous. If you
I
haven't
tried.
been hallucinated, then you don't exist.
You don't count.
Okay. So you can identify those, or M dashes and all of these kind of telltale
Yeah.
signs, but you can only imagine it's going to get more sophisticated, and these and harder to identify, as those technologies develop. But certainly in the social sciences where I work, and speaking to colleagues and people who are involved in editing journals. This is a real thing now that they're having to cope with. Just the
Hmm.
massive influx of AI produced stuff, whether it be the obvious ones where the whole, someone just goes to Chat GPT and says, "Write me a paper about enshittification of academic work," and
Hmm. In
or
the
where
for
they just
in
use.
according to the guidelines for the conversation.
Right.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, actually, but also, I mean, people are using it in more subtle ways as well. And not to say that there's no legitimate use for generative AI in research, but there are certainly plenty of illegitimate ones with massive incentives for people. And you feel particularly concerned about younger academics, early career researchers. In the US system, people who are looking still kind of on the tenure clock, who are under such intense pressure to publish in what is an increasingly competitive environment, and where in many cases their careers and livelihoods depend on it. That's putting people in an awful, awful position. I mean, as universities, what kind of environment are we creating just on a human level? What kind of profession is this that places people in this awful predicament that can, lead them down a terrible road?
Right. So it's interesting
Right. And
because
then
the reprocessing of all of this research into LLMs is a further commodification of the research.
Mm,
And Joy and I kind of grew up in the scientific publishing industry when journals were really community or organs, and
yeah.
they could be quirky, right? Because they weren't being processed by third parties and digested into larger systems, and so you could have them be quirky, but also the fact that you as a practitioner in a field or a researcher in that field received that journal, that was a marker that you were part of that community, right? And the
Mm,
editors and authors would be in a conversation with that community. It was partly to teach you the culture of that community and also to bring you up to speed with the latest findings, right? So, and a lot of those quirky elements of journals have been erased by the fact that it's been commodified. And I think
mm.
people don't realize how much journals have changed because of this commodification. They're no longer cultural touchstones for communities. They're places to process prestige points.
Mhm.
I was doing a kind of annual review process with a young academic a few years ago, and it's one of those things he had to kind of set out what his goals would be for the next year, and he put in there his main goal was to publish a paper in what we call in this country an A-star journal, top tier journal. And I saw this goal, and he didn't actually say what the paper was going to be about or what its contribution would be or anything. And I said to him, I said, you have this goal of wanting to publish in an A-star paper. Don't you have a goal of wanting to make a contribution to some kind of body of research or a
To discover
contribution
something
to a
amazing,
community of
yeah.
scholars or discover something? And he kind of looked at me like I was some old fuddy-duddy living in a world in the past. Because I'm also old enough to remember working at this time where it was about finding your audience and kind of making a contribution. I remember my early publications I had when I started publishing in some of these journals. What was exciting to me is that I was publishing in journals where the papers I admired were published. That was like a
Yeah.
huge thing as a young academic when I was kind of starting out. In my case, kind of
You were
late
entering the
90s.
conversation, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
and to be able to do that, kind of mattered in terms of developing an identity as an academic, developing an identity as a researcher, kind of getting to know other people. Literally, people, many people now who I count as my friends were kind of built through that, and it wasn't just about counting things on a CV for whatever purpose. So I think again it can appear nostalgic in a way, but I think I don't know, I miss those days. I mean they weren't perfect. There was lots of other problems around, but it certainly felt like being an academic was a question of a vocation rather than just a question of working in a system of employment.
Mm.
Martina, back to the point that on that thread, the point that you made earlier about people needing to publish, and it's hard to get into these community journals, maybe the one that you wanted to. And so therefore the market has created the opportunity for all of these additional publishing outlets through these different publishers. And so there's the tension there, right? Between we don't want so much, but we need a place to publish so that we can keep doing our jobs. And
Yeah.
what are the from an economics business perspective, how do you reconcile this tension?
Mm. I mean, I think the problem really starts already with, essentially the tenure clock of a lot of academics these days, right? When you have to publish that many papers in journals that are of a certain quality. And that means that in your tenure time, you already need to start producing and you need to find outlets for these articles. And obviously, the higher the journal, the better. But if that's not the case, then somewhere else, and as good as it can get. And if that doesn't happen, then somewhere else. And I mean, I have been sitting on so many panels for doctoral students and postdocs, and everyone keeps asking me, oh, but how do I get it published in that journal? It's not really around, is this an important question? Am I making an important contribution? Is this really furthering science? It's literally like, how do I get into this journal? And
Yeah.
ideally fast, right? So look, I think from an academic side, we really need to start to rethink this. Is this really what we want, right? Is this really just what we need to have people, publishing a certain number of articles at certain career stages? That obviously also leads to a situation whereby once people have tenure, that, they very much change in terms of the publication output afterwards, depending on the incentive system of the university. And I just don't think this is creating a very, very good sustainable model. But then I also really believe that, yeah, at the moment, the system is just really being exploited through commercial interests because it does create this need to publish. It does create all these incentives. And that's a way to make money, right? And just even I think a lot of the traditional publishers have now realized that, yep, they can also benefit from this business model, right? So even, publishers that weren't part of this, pay for publish momentum just a few years ago, they have also shifted. Some of the journals now move towards continuous publishing models. So there's no longer,
Hmm.
issues and page numbers. It's essentially just article after article after article after article. There's no limit anymore. Everything can just be published online whenever it appears, right? And in my field, I see that with ESG, environmental social governance indicators, because there's always been this debate if, ESG, a good ESG leads to good corporate performance. So if a company is more highly ranked in terms of ESG, does that have an impact on financial performance? The volume of work we are seeing on this is just second to none. I mean, as an editor for one of the journals that I'm involved with, we are just getting literally dozens of these submissions, one after the next, after the next, after the next. And there is just, I mean, my question is, what is this adding, right? What are we trying to prove or disprove here? What is the outcome meant to be? And then, of course, most studies have a positive correlation because we probably do have a bias towards, significant findings can be published. then we get the occasional study that's trying to disprove everything. But, my real question is, okay, what where are we trying to go with this stuff? What are we
Right,
trying to
Mhm.
right.
say? What kind of impact is this making? What are our recommendations for anyone working in industry? No one is reading that stuff anyway. So, for me, it
Yeah.
just relates to really fundamental questions. But to come back to your point, this commercialization, I mean, when we look at the pure market dynamics, it can only be commercialized because there is demand. If there was no demand, there would be no such offering in the marketplace, right? So
Hmm.
if there's no one happy to pay, this type of system would just immediately collapse. If we were all not happy to do this as of tomorrow, then there would be no pay for publishing charges anymore, right? No author fees, no types of commercial business models. But when you look at the sheer size of it, it obviously means there is a huge demand because the publishers keep going, they keep making money, they've got extremely attractive business models, and it's branching out into all sorts of other things, right? So you can have your paper professionally edited through a publisher these days, right? So there's that type of author
Mhm.
support.
Hmm.
They offer you all sorts of other services, right? So definitely this whole marketization goes way beyond just charging
Yeah.
people
The
to have their
producers
paper
have been
published.
turned into a market rather
Yeah.
than the consumers, right?
Right.
But what's amazing about it all is that academics, we do all the work for free. We write the papers and send them off. We don't get it. This is by one estimation, a $19 billion industry, which places it somewhere in size, between the music industry and the movie business, right?
Hmm.
And we write them for free. We work as editors for free. We do reviewing for free. But it's not actually for free. We're paid by our universities. And
Right.
if you are part of a public university, as Martina and I are, most universities in this country being public, what that amounts to is a transfer of funds from public hands to private hands. It's a cash grab by the corporate economy from public organizations, and it works because academics need it. We've been kind of tied into what's effectively become a monopoly, and the term enshittification we adapted from Cory Doctorow's use of the term in relation to what's happening in the internet, and he makes this point that even though internet services like Facebook he talks about and Amazon are kind of getting increasingly kind of worse. They're monopolies, so we don't really have an alternative. And similarly for academics, the commercial publishing system, on the one hand, it's a highly concentrated market, but there's no real alternatives but to engage with the corporate publishing if we want to publish. And for people, if they don't publish in academic peer-reviewed journals, then that affects promotions and careers and so forth. So I mean, we've kind of suggested that there should be some alternatives. Martina was just talking about them, but let's not pretend that it's going to be easy to get out of this fine mess we find ourselves in.
Well, it's also interesting because when, before the pay to play model, to start a publication, it would take years to get it up and running and to build up the subscription file large enough so you would know that it was going to be sustainable and you could make a go of it. And I
Mhm.
think we've actually seen publishers like Frontiers, MDPI, and others pop up and become huge really, really quickly. And those are outside of the normal the commercial publishers that we would probably rattle off, would have rattled off 10 years ago. And so it's
Mhm.
also interesting how this model has, created these kind of, pop-up publishers that can grow really, really, like weeds, super fast with this model too. So I think that's an interesting aspect of this that is a little bit new
Well,
Yeah.
and it's also incentivized the traditional publishers to diversify their portfolios
and to mimic them.
to create cascading levels of journals under the same umbrella. And so there is that competition for market share I think back to, I can't remember which of you said at the beginning, it's the competition for submissions, right?
Hmm.
So traditionally in a subscription-based model, the submissions are good up until a certain point, and then they're just a cost because you're going to have to reject them, and it's expensive to filter out submissions, and because you need to only deliver a certain number of papers to your subscribing audience. When you don't have subscribers, you don't have anybody who can cancel you. Your incentive is to publish as many as possible. So the land grab went between competing for subscribers to competing for submissions.
Yep.
I think too. I mean, I remember it's happened a few years ago now, but a lot of the journals that I read and publish in went through a process of expanding the number of issues where it used to be bi-monthly, now they come out every month, or what used to be quarterly, and so forth. And again, that's kind of with technology as because they don't need to print and distribute physical copies in the same way that was done before. You can just kind of produce more and more. And I think it's also a business model, as you said, not relying on subscribers, but relying on library purchasing and purchasing, and kind of contracts that libraries have with publishers to take on a whole range of journals. Again, another example of public money being transferred into private hands.
Yep.
Mhm. Before we wrap up, what would you like to recommend that people in scholarly publishing do to counteract the enshittification?
You mean the
Other
writers
than
or the
other
publishers?
other other than read your paper. Do
They,
you have any
they,
do you have any calls to action?
Yeah, look, I think first of all, we need to take a good hard look at ourselves. I think, and to really see what are we incentivizing? Are we incentivizing good research and good science, or are we incentivizing volumes of publishing and publications, right? I mean, I can understand from university perspective that, there's certainly an interest to make sure that, people are doing their job and doing their job well, but simply looking at output metrics as the only indicator in many instances is definitely driving this very problematic model. So if there was even just a bigger, sort of an emphasis placed on, what are you actually researching? How is that leading, to a good benefit or output in terms of, societal good, furthering certain debates, creating important insights? So rather than just looking at the end goal of having the publication, actually looking at the process of knowledge creation and making sure that people are working on that, and that we actually contribute to meaningful research and not just volume research. So I think that's where we have to start. Um, I mean, then we also hope that the article has obviously drawn attention to this issue. So hopefully there will be a bit more of a critical look, especially at people or some researchers that have just like hundreds of publications per year without necessarily having the ability to write all of them. There are certainly these kind of extreme cases out there. So hopefully it kind of draws attention to these types of issues. Certainly I don't think there's anything wrong with people being more prolific at publishing than others and having more outputs, right? But I think we really, as a community as well, we just need to think about, what are we trying to support here? And what are we trying to get out of this? What's the end goal? And the end goal can't just be publishing for publishing's sake, which
Hmm.
it currently is. So yeah, I think we need to start with our own models, own evaluation systems, the things that we do as individual researchers as well, to make sure that we produce good stuff, but not just mass produce stuff, and that we are also really thinking about the bigger purpose of the research that we are doing.
Yeah, I mean, just
Great.
reflecting on that too. Another, I mean, kind of saying it in a different way. I think for all of us, is to remind ourselves why we became interested in this work in the first place. And it wasn't to become, small cogs in the massive machine of academic capitalism. We had some other reason, of wanting to be, in some people's cases, a scientist, of wanting to be an intellectual, of wanting to kind of live a thinking life. And to not forget where that all came from as you get caught up in the machinations and kind of, drowned in the atmosphere. Remember what that purpose is and let that purpose inform what we do in full knowledge of the mess that we're in, but not necessarily kowtowing to it.
Fantastic. All right, this has been great, but now it is time to move on to Discoveries of the Week. All right, so we're going to talk about some discoveries of the week, and we're going to let our guests proceed. Do you each have one, or
Yeah. All
who's
right.
leading?
I've got lots actually. I'm always reading this newsletter that I'm getting about, the top discoveries across all different fields. I always personally find that really interesting to kind of look beyond my own disciplinary boundaries just to see what is happening elsewhere. I have to see this week I was very glad to find out that drinking coffee can lower your dementia risk apparently. So for me, that was
That is true. Yes.
that was
Yes.
supporting my own assumptions. So very
Yes.
glad to have come across that kind of study, right? I mean, that's an interesting field as well. Every few years we are getting, a different kind of outcomes, obviously, in terms of wine is good for you, coffee is good for you, and then essentially a couple of years later you hear the opposite. So on this particular occasion, I was actually very glad to find out that there is, such a positive correlation. So that encouraged me to immediately get another cup of coffee. So
when
my
when the pendulum swings your way, you got to go
Yeah.
with it.
absolutely. I definitely was very, very glad to be supported in my habits there.
Yeah. And have a little bit of dark chocolate with it as well. Yeah.
Carl, you have one?
I do. A little less amusing than that one, I'm afraid to say. As I said before, a lot of my work's looking at kind of business and society relations, particularly as it relates to inequality. And I've just been reading the World Inequality Report 26. It was actually released in December of last year by the World Inequality Lab, which is run between the Paris School of Economics and UC Berkeley, and they kind of look at what's happening based on huge data sets. They don't publish the work through commercial publishers, by the way. It's freely available from them. But unfortunately, things are getting worse because what I discovered was that in the past 30 years, the wealth owned by the top 0.001% of people has is equivalent to 12% of the global income of everybody as it was then. And now it's gone up to a third. And what that means is that over the
Wow.
past 3 decades, global multimillionaire wealth has tripled relative to world income. So just more details about another, pardon my language, kind of shit that we're getting in around the world.
You're absolutely right. It's alarming and wrong, but that's an important discovery, and it's important to remind ourselves of that those things are going on. Well, mine is one that when I wrote it out, Joy can attest to this. This has been kicking around for a few weeks, and I finally landed this week. And then I thought, but I'm talking to people in Australia, and they're close to New Zealand. This may look like apple polishing, but it's not. It was legitimate finding. So it's been 25 years since the Lord of the Rings original trilogy came out. And so I went and rewatched it. And what struck me is that I've gotten used to, I think like all of us have, the pace of a streaming series. or those 8 to 10 episode things. And the pace is extremely slow, but you get used to it, so you don't realize how slow and drawn out it all is with these overhead shots of cars driving down roads and long, pullbacks from the sunset and all this stuff to pad time. And then I watched these 3 movies, and they were just cracking along. I mean, just so fast and so much story, so much character development, all beautifully placed and paced. And I'm like, so that's how you tell a cracking story. You don't
Mm.
drag it out. And why can't we? So it just made me think, I hope at some point we reach a kind of fatigue with these 8 to 10 episode series and they come out with like just 2 really good episodes, just get it
Mhm.
done. So that was my discovery of the week, is that when you can cram a ton of story into 6 hours or 7 hours, and you don't need to, drag it out like they do on so many of these shows. So
Well, my discovery of the week is something that was 41 years in the making, which 41 years ago, Tony Hawk did the first 720, Tony Hawk the skateboarder. And he recently put out an international competition call to see who could do it hands-free. It's never been done before, the 720 Ollie. And it was cracked and won by a 12-year-old from Japan who taught himself to do it because he knew that the competition was happening. So it's not like he already knew how to do it. He just put his mind to it and he figured it out
that's a good
and
incentive.
he just broke skateboarding, forever. So congratulations to Ao Nishikawa, who won Tony Hawk's Ollie 720 challenge.
That's
I'm
amazing.
having memories now of playing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater on PlayStation with my
Yeah.
kids like 25 years ago.
Yeah, so 41 years since it was first invented and to when it was finally cracked. So, yeah. I don't
Wow.
know if that makes me feel old or young or somewhere in between, but the fact that a 12-year-old figured it
Just
out is
dazzled. We can just feel
pretty
dazzled.
awesome.
Yeah, that makes you feel ageless to be dazzled by somebody with that kind of grit and determination. That's awesome. Well, thank you both for taking the time to talk with us. We really appreciate it, and we love your work. I think you're on the right scent. Ew,
Yeah.
sorry, I shouldn't have used that with enshittification, but you know what I mean. Anyhow,
Yeah.
we really appreciate it, and thank you so much. All right, that was great. Of course,
Yeah.
they were really nice to be patient with us as we did time zone math.
Yeah. But also super thoughtful
Hmm.
and every time we talk to people kind of outside of our little bubble, we learn something new from their perspectives, and context is always important when we're
Hmm.
looking at these issues. And a lot of the time we see at the academic publishing industry level a flattening of incentives, priorities, mandates, and things like that. And so it's really important for us as we learn and grow in how we understand what's happening around the globe to listen to people who are dealing with the effects of what the industry is doing at the ground level. And that's
Right.
what they're doing.
Yep. Absolutely. And it still leaves plenty of room for people who are coming from inside the industry to point to talk about some of the things that they can't see from that perspective. So
Yeah.
that's interesting too. All right. So hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks to our friends at Provoke the Truth for the music. If you have topics you want us to cover, please email us at disruptedscience@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. You can also keep up with developments at the Geyser, where you can subscribe to support our efforts. And thanks for listening.
Thanks. See you later.